So welcome everybody to the presentation of the Distinguished Research Award. And my name is Ka-Yi Young. I'm the chair of Faculty Assembly this year. And today we would like to congratulate Associate Professor Eric Madfis. He's an associate professor of criminal justice on our campus. And as a researcher and scholar, Associate Professor Eric Madfis has been exceptionally productive in conducting high-quality research focused on violence. His 2014 book, The Risk of School Rampage, is referenced frequently and has affected policy debates in the field, including opening up discussion regarding overreaction to the fear of school violence. Dr. Madfis' numerous articles and book chapters review an interdisciplinary scholarly mind built on strong theoretical and empirical foundations. The policy implications of his work were recognized by an invitation to brief the US Congress on school violence and safety. And his research is frequently cited in the news media. Dr. Madfis engages globally and with local nonprofits to use insights from his research to prevent school violence. So with this introduction, let us all congratulate Dr. Madfis. And
thank you. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you all, and thank you all for coming. I'll start just by saying what an honor and really quite a surprise it was to win this award. It really does mean a lot to me, so I really do want to thank my colleagues and mentors and students, and also my wife, who is here, and at least momentarily, with our small child, so we'll see how long that lasts. Thanks very much for enabling and encouraging and supporting me to continue doing this work. I'm glad to talk a little bit about some of my research in school violence and have an opportunity to discuss sort of various forms of prevention, what does work and what doesn't work, and also to answer any questions that you have. So I will say I would like this, if possible, if you guys have questions as we go, to do it that way, have it slightly be more of a conversation if possible than me just sort of talking for the full time. So I'm happy to do that. If you do have questions, raise your hand or let me know. That'd be great. Otherwise, I'm going to talk a little bit about, mostly I'll be talking about the majority of my work on school violence prevention and sort of from my book. I'll talk a little bit about some other work and some other sort of theoretical pieces and other things that looking at this, giving you a sort of an overview about research on school violence and what works in prevention. And a lot of my work has focused on this, looking at school violence, the school-to-prison pipeline, particularly a lot of work on mass shootings and the reaction to them, what their causes are, how we as a society fear them and often overreact to them, and also looking at sort of empirical research to understand how to actually prevent them. So this work has entailed looking at causes, at warning signs, profiles, patterns at the schools and communities where school shootings tend to occur, media coverage of these events, the gender dynamics at play in both school shootings and mass shootings, why it is that so many of them, almost all of them basically, tend to be committed by boys and men, why that is. And also looking at the sort of why some particular attacks have been prevented and the school policies and practices which actually help prevent them. So I'll talk a little bit, very briefly, about threat assessment and how that's useful as opposed to other forms of more problematic forms of profiling. And I'll talk sort of also about restorative discipline and sort of restorative justice in schools and why that's a helpful way forward too. And these are sort of productive ways to look at this stuff, as opposed to a lot of the things that we currently tend to do, which are not necessarily very helpful in preventing school violence and actually in many ways serve to exacerbate them and actually make them happen more frequently. So the title of my talk here, and where's the clicker, by the way? If I could have that, that'd be great. Thank you very much. So the title of my talk, right, is We Call BS, Facts and Fictions About Preventing School Shootings. And I think this title here comes from particularly a talk that Emma Gonzalez here on the top left was a student at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School when she was addressing a gun control rally days after a school shooting at her school in Florida where 17 people were killed. This is last February. I use this title in part, I think, because it's a helpful way in which he sort of frames this stuff to talk about a lot of the policies and practices that we do in school violence prevention as being not based in empirical evidence really at all, and what actually prevents these things. And a lot of it really is is BS. A lot of it is not sort of true, honest conversations about things. So I'm going to show you guys a brief clip here, and then talk about sort of the implications and the larger sort of significance of thinking about things that way.
The people in the government who were voted into power are lying to us. And us kids seem to be the only ones who notice and are prepared to call BS. Companies trying to make caricatures of the teenagers nowadays, saying that all we are is self-involved and trend-obsessed, and they hush us into submissions when our message doesn't reach the ears of the nation. We are prepared to call BS. Politicians who sit in their gilded House and Senate seats funded by the NRA telling us nothing could have ever been done to prevent this. We call BS. They say that tougher gun laws do not decrease gun violence. We call BS. They say a good guy with a gun stops a bad guy with a gun. We call BS. They say guns are just tools like knives and are as dangerous as cars. We call BS. They say that no laws could have been able to prevent the hundreds of senseless tragedies that have occurred. We call BS. That us kids don't know what we're talking about, that we're too young to understand how the government works. We call BS. If you agree, register to vote. Contact your local congresspeople. Give them a piece of your mind.
I'll address sort of some of the things that she said there, and I think why that's a helpful way to think about some of this stuff is that often the debates around school shootings really is largely BS. That's true regarding the gun control debate in many ways, as she notes, right? Politicians are lying and compromised by the NRA. You know, the policies that we have generally to deal with these things, you know, are influenced by lobbyists and gun manufacturers. Not even the NRA members themselves in terms of what they actually want is not necessarily what our gun policy is reflected by. There's a lot of policy and legal reform which could be implemented to vastly reduce school and other mass shootings, including but not limited to various forms of gun control. And the fact that the US has so many guns and such ease of access to guns is part of the cause. Certainly that's true. You know, her mentioning there that they're not just another tool like a car or a knife is I think, an apt comparison if you think about these things. So it is true that lots of other countries, even countries that have very heavy forms of gun control, do still have examples of mass shootings. So that there's a number of and mass attacks of other kinds. In China, there has been a spate in recent years of mass stabbings, mass attacks in elementary schools, usually by older adults who come in and attack a number of elementary school students, and usually it's with knives or axes or things like that. And so there's been a lot of people injured in those attacks to us, but you just don't have very many people die. So the level of fatalities that we've had, which have been sort of exponentially growing, and we have a lot more deaths in the last 20 years, a lot more people die in these events than previously have. And part of that is reflected in you know, the more accessibility of semi-automatic weapons, and just generally the weapons accessibility of firearms in particular, which allows you to kill a lot of people very quickly in a way that isn't true with knives or other weapons. So I think that's an important point. But more broadly, what I want to talk about a little bit today is how much BS there really is regarding sort of larger political and policy conversations around school shooting prevention. Debates are often completely devoid of empirical evidence. Most solutions are really about satiating fear and about hype, and often influenced by what is profitable, not necessarily what actually works. So more guns for more money, more security for more money, and school exclusion. So increasingly sort of kicking kids out of school because that is a financially expedient way to deal with problems as well. And in fact, much of what we are doing, you know, amplified security and increasingly harsh discipline, which I'll talk about in a little bit, actually make them more likely to occur. So I'll talk about how that's the case, and then we'll talk about sort of what exist in terms of actually proven solutions to prevent school shootings and other forms of school violence that exist if we have the political will to actually enact them. So first, I'll just mention briefly why would someone be interested in studying such a pleasant and uplifting topic as school shootings, as I have devoted like a large portion of my life and career to. And part of that really is a result of an experience that I had back when I was still in high school. And was sort of a direct reflection of the changing disciplinary climate that was happening at the end of the 1990s into the early 21st century. So the tragedy of the mass shooting at Columbine High School occurred during my junior year. That's in April 1999. And afterwards, there was a lot of fear. Students and parents were genuinely concerned that these types of massacres were going to start happening sort of all around the country. If you looked at polls, most people said that it was likely that there was going to be one happening at their schools soon at the time. People believed that. And certainly there were copycats, and there were a number of incidents years after that. But in many respects, the nation did undergo sort of a whole-scale moral panic. This really sort of fear, exaggerated sort of fervent fear that these things were happening far more frequently than they really were occurring, and sort of this emotional reaction far beyond the rational extent of the problem. And so what happened to me, basically roughly a year after Columbine, this is the spring of 2000, this is my senior year in high school, school officials were alerted to some graffiti that had been written inside one of the boys' room stalls. It was written on the wall, and it said, Columbine could happen here, and had a date, a couple months in the future, right? So there was lots of debate and conversation among the community about what should be done about this. They ultimately, sort of administrators decide to still have the school day, to still have school in session that day. But what basically happens is that people hear about it and are concerned, and so very few people go to school. I did end up going. I went that day. Why did I go? Partially, I went because I had been reading some, pundits and people talking about this, saying that, it's mostly kids. It's kids who basically have been bullied, and they're getting revenge on people who had bullied them. And I was like, oh, I never bullied anyone, so I'll be fine. I'll go ahead. In retrospect, that's not necessarily the most rational, best way to think about that. It is true that they often will target specific people or specific groups, but they also often just go for volume and try to kill as many people as they can, right? So not necessarily the best thinking at the time. So I'm there, I go all day, and basically at the end of the day, my last period of school that day, I start walking to my locker with one of my friends. So my friend Matt, he's sort of your typical sort of skater kid, not necessarily the best student, but a nice kid, certainly not a violent kid by any means. So we're walking down the hallway to our lockers. And he says to me, right as we're turning around a corner, he says, boy, today sure was disappointing. Those are his exact words. I remember them very, very clearly. He says those exact words. As we're turning the corner, the vice principal, the one who's in charge of discipline for the school, is turning around the corner at the exact same time, overhears that, and basically it gets interpreted as a threat. There's multiple ways you maybe could interpret that line. First of all, I should say, did he write the graffiti on the wall? Absolutely not. Did he mean that today was disappointing because there weren't sufficient people there today for him to kill people? Absolutely not. He did not mean that. Was he maybe making a sarcastic comment, saying today was sort of disappointing because it was a lack of excitement after this day that had been hyped up for so long, people expressed so much fear about that nothing happened, perhaps. But it also could have been equally plausible he was just sort of expressing annoyance at a day where we basically did nothing and learned nothing all day long, right? Sort of a waste of a day. So, but ultimately, regardless of those various ways you could interpret it, it was interpreted as a threat. That was how it was interpreted, which needed to be harshly punished. And this was sort of at the height, although it still progresses in many ways and in many places, of this new era of zero tolerance in schools, where basically you want strict punishments are uniformly applied to everyone, regardless of the context, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of what the intent was, whatever he meant to say is not important. And so there was a wave of this after Columbine, but still remains in many ways, this sort of extreme penalties for things that would have previously been treated as minor offenses. Which is an influence in terms of what we now call sort of the school to prison pipeline, where we increasingly address things not just in-house in the school by the administrators in the school, but with detentions or things like that, but increasingly have often automatic suspensions or expulsions or even automatic arrests for various things. So ultimately, right, the school decides to interpret it as a threat. He is suspended, but he's suspended for a lengthy period of time, but ultimately it's really an expulsion. He really is told that he's not really welcome to come back to the school. That message is made pretty clear to him. So technically in a suspension, but really that was his last day of school. He did not go back to high school or go to college after that. He did not go, that was his last day of school. So in reaction to this, I think this was an influential event for me, made me interested in understanding not only what causes school shootings, but also how we respond to them, what are sort of more nuanced, measured, reasonable ways to deal with this problem and to react to it in schools. So we're not just sort of, ruining kids' lives in this way. So we'll talk a little bit now just about sort of the prevalence of school shootings to keep this some context for these kinds of events. These are two sort of recent studies, one by Mother Jones, one by the FBI, both of which conclude that school shootings and also public mass shootings more generally have increased in recent years. So they are happening more frequently than they used to in the last couple decades. However, they still are exceedingly rare. Right? So overall, if you look at rates of school violence or school homicide, those are down, as are homicides more generally. All these things are actually down in recent years. But if you look at this stuff in general, they are sort of exceedingly rare. So just some examples here, right? Any given school can expect to experience a student homicide once every 6,000 years, right? Only about 1 in 2 million school-age youth will die from homicide or suicide at school each year. So you're technically more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to have someone die of a homicide or suicide at school. Give you some context about how often these things really do occur. And also, right, they're actually the safest place for schools. You're actually much safer in school than you are on the street or at home, issues of domestic violence or other kinds of things that you might experience. Schools are really the safest place for children. That remains to be true, and it's important to keep in mind. That said, of course, when they do happen, right, they are devastating beyond the horror of the casualties themselves. They devastate communities. They leave survivors and bystanders and actually even newspaper reporters with post-traumatic stress. They create extensive public fear. However, it's important to keep in mind that they are rare when we discuss their role in influencing policy, which they are sort of disproportionately influential. We do often base school policy and school disciplinary policy on these kind of events as opposed to much more common forms of school misbehavior, like bullying and things like that. And so important to sort of have a measured response that doesn't overreact and unintentionally change the school environment for the worse in the process. So talk a little bit about the causes of school rampage. Any initial takers, what people think the causes might be? Any guesses? So it is a multifaceted problem. There's lots of causes at different levels. However, there is a lot of misinformation, particularly when the media talks about these things. Kids coming from broken homes without fathers, child abuse, violent video games, TV or music, lack of prayer in school. These are things you hear which have literally zero empirical evidence behind any of those. All of those things have no support whatsoever of any kind. You can go into that in more detail if you want. But in contrast, we can talk about the things that there is evidence for and what really are sort of the causes that researchers have found. So mental health issues, first of all, I'll say it is true that often in most cases there's no documented evidence of mental health, of mental health issues, of mental illness in majority of cases. There isn't that. That doesn't mean that there aren't necessarily issues, but just they haven't sort of been officially documented. But if we look at the different types, right, personality disorders, things like psychopathy, actually is quite rare in school shooters. It's rare with mass shooters more generally. People who kill a lot of people in one event, like at a workplace or a movie theater or something. In general, psychopathy is pretty common among serial killers, that's true. Not so common among school shooters and mass shooters, actually, though there have been some cases. Similarly, we think about things like psychosis. So sort of we think about forms of classically what we might think of as insanity, things like schizophrenia. There have definitely been cases of school shooters who have been schizophrenic, but that's also rare. That's also not in the majority by any means, but it does happen. The things that are most common, depression and suicidal ideation, right? So someone wants to kill themselves, and often they do kill themselves at the end of these attacks, or that they're depressed, right? And that's the most common form of mental illness you have with these school shooters. Of course, depression is a pretty common feature of a large segment of the population, just more generally. Other things that researchers have looked at, right? Negative relationship with peers, such as victimization through bullying. Definitely is true in a number of cases, not necessarily every case, but in the majority of cases, that is the case. Things like exclusionary teenage cliques, intolerant, homogeneous communities. There's a lot of research that shows that these are the types of communities and schools where these things happen, where there's sort of more tolerance for bullying, where there is a very sort of strict notion of what is normal, what is acceptable behavior, particularly around gender norms. But not only that, so if you're gay, not only if you maybe look different or dress different, if there's less tolerance for those kinds of things, and everyone sort of is the same, is ethnically homogeneous or homogeneous in other kinds of ways, are the communities where these things tend to occur. And part of that is because these are situations where if you feel isolated, you're not necessarily going to have the same supports you would have in other places where there's more diverse sort of communities. Gender norms around masculinity. Certainly, I think this is part of the issue we need to look at. If we talk about homicide more generally, that's about 90% of homicides are committed by boys and men. If we talk about mass murders like serial killing and mass shootings, we're talking about 95%, sometimes 97%, depending on how you measure it. So a high proportion. But if we're talking about school shootings, even more so. There's only about 4 cases in American history where you had sort of a school shooting committed by a girl or a woman. So very few cases there. So definitely, I think looking at masculinity, cultural norms around how people are expected to behave around genders. Gender is important, particularly, these are often boys and men who have felt emasculated, who have felt that they can't perform their masculinity in traditional ways and have failed, to either be athletic or get lots of girlfriends or have lots of relationships or to be popular or to be successful in terms of work, things like this. All of these things where traditionally men could perform their masculinity in a more helpful way. They're not able to do that, so often it is a recourse for men we do a sort of, in our culture, associate violence with masculinity, so it's a way to perform your masculinity if you can't do it in other sort of mechanisms, right? It's a way to sort of this last sort of power showing sort of male dominance to show that you're tough and you are important and matter and are masculine in that way. Desire for fame and infamy. It is true that the vast majority of these cases, people explicitly have talked about their desire for fame, and they're wanting to be famous from perpetrating these acts, and that they often get what they want in that way. They often do become nationally or often internationally famous as a result of committing these attacks in a way that they couldn't through more legitimate means. Right, and so that is one thing my colleague at the University of Alabama, Adam Langford, and I have written publicly in a number of media outlets and also some articles about this, talking to people about not necessarily glamorizing these offenders and limiting the extent to which you mention their name or show their photo in media coverage. And lastly, gun availability. Certainly, there is definitely a correlation between the quantity of gun ownership in a country and the number of mass shootings. So I think that is sort of part of this issue that's a legitimate one to address as well, certainly. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about my theory here called cumulative strain theory, which is increasingly getting some more attention and actually has been some good empirical tests of it recently, which is kind of exciting. But basically, it's a multi-layered, sort of multi-stage theory as to what leads to these events. Sort of 5-stage that are cumulative, so it's not just any of these one things, but it's sort of the cumulative aspects of going through all of these stages in a sort of chronological manner, which helps explain them. So the first is the idea of chronic strain, basically long-term frustrations that people experience, disappointments and failures throughout their lives. It is true that both school shooters and mass shooters tend to experience lots and lots of failures. They tend to get fired lots of times. They tend to experience lots of bullying or job losses or other kind of romantic rejections, things like this throughout their lives. That's true of both mass shooters and school shooters as well. And sort of they also tend to be in this sort of uncontrolled state. This is coming from sort of control theory, the idea that often if you have negative things happening in your life, you might have a support system in place to help you deal with it, to help you come to terms with that. You might have people you can go to if you have an issue. And these are often people who do not have that. Either they are sort of the stereotypical sort of image of a school shooter who's a loner, so they don't have friends or a lot of close family members that they can go to if they're experiencing a stressful life event. Or they might have someone else. There have been examples of like killer duos, people like that's true of Columbine and other cases as well, where people sort of reinforce each other's sort of negative ideas and values and sort of build together to commit an attack rather than solving their problems in a more pro-social way. And the next stage is acute strain, which is the fact that there typically is a sort of catastrophic loss, or one at least that's a loss that's perceived as catastrophic before someone starts planning these kind of attacks, and often they are sometimes being dumped, sometimes being fired, being expelled. The Newtown shooter, he was forced to move out of his house when he was sort of terrified of even leaving his bedroom, right? So things like this, these sort of as a last straw. Sometimes that could even be like something that's not real if you're suffering a mental break and you're not stop taking your medication. It could be a number of different things, but ultimately, right, this acute strain, this sort of short-term loss that one experiences, which leads to the planning stage. And it is true, often the media sort of portrays these kind of events as someone snapping and suddenly deciding to kill someone, which really does not happen in basically any case. They are usually planned well in advance, fantasized about for a long period of time, often for days, weeks, sometimes even months and years. We know for a fact, again in Columbine, that they planned that, documented that they were planning that event for at least a year. And so they often plan these things sort of at great length, and they often also tell people about their plans, which I'll come back to because that's an important sort of intervention stage. But that is true, they often do try to recruit people or brag about it, tell other people sort of during the process of that stage. And then the last is the massacre itself, which you need to have sort of multiple people sort of collectively despised by the shooter, or a location that is symbolic for some reason, who are sort of congregated closely together in classrooms or other public spaces. It definitely helps if they have access to and training in firearms, not just knives or other kinds of things where you might injure a lot of people, but you're not going to kill so many. And so these sort of things all contribute in different kinds of ways towards helping to understand sort of why these things happen and what is pretty common in the majority of these offenders' lives. Okay. I'll move on now to a large section of my research and my book as well, talking about averted school shootings. So over the last few decades, we've had lots of successfully completed mass shootings and school shootings, which have been granted a lot of attention by the media and by academics. So there's a number of recent research certainly on this topic in general. However, at the same time, there's been dozens of averted incidents where students had plots to kill multiple peers and faculty members, but which ultimately came to the attention of authorities and were thwarted as a result of that. And so I'll talk about this and the 195 cases that I looked at. You see some headlines here from foiled plots. And there are lots of different examples of what this could entail potentially. Someone makes a hit list, a suicide note. They amassed arsenals of weapons, not just guns, but also things like pipe bombs, homemade napalm, things like that. Sometimes notebooks detailing every sort of stage of what they plan to do, where, when, who they wanted to kill in what order, all sorts of sort of elaborate plans in some of these cases. And so, though this topic is really understudied, I'm one of like really 2 or 3 researchers who've ever studied this. It's really important, right? Because it's important to understand its clear practical significance. What we should have future interventions, future sort of solutions and policies modeled on what actually works, on prior successes. And so, just briefly, sort of what I looked at here, right? Definitions of mass shooting and school shootings vary a lot different definitions by, if you have what weapons, if they were, a former student or not, what are the relationships between people, how many victims. There's lots of different definitions that are used. I was trying to get at sort of the most broad understanding of this that you could. So basically, former or current students threatened to harm multiple victims with any form of weaponry. So not just school shootings, but school bombings, and there were a number of averted school bombings, sometimes both, bombing and a potential shooting as well, but where basically no one was ultimately killed or injured. And so this varied a great deal, right? So we're talking about what kind of cases were included in this. Often you could not tell by media coverage whether or not a case was really extreme and severe or not. So that included cases where someone just wrote a list of people they didn't like on one end, which was interpreted as a hit list, to on the other end, someone having an arsenal of bombs and weapons and guns, and journals detailing who they wanted to kill, again, in what order, who they didn't want to kill, why they were doing it, all sort of elaborate sort of planning process that also fit under this sort of category. So all are included just to sort of look at, this is a sort of basic, first look at this kind of research where there isn't a lot of data that I would to work with beforehand. So just briefly here, right? So I located 195 cases, various different databases, 195 cases across the United States. And then I was living in Boston at the time, so I went specifically to schools around the Northeast. And I was granted access to 11 public schools across the Northeast that had thwarted a rampage attack. That included in-depth interviews with 32 people who were directly involved in averting the incident. That meant, administrators like principals and vice principals, assistant principals, guidance counselors, adjustment counselors, security and police officers, arresting officers in some cases, and teachers, sort of all directly involved. And then sort of to clarify that people are, what people are telling you is true. Also, some people tell you different things also, right? Triangulated with newspaper reporting, court transcripts, legal briefs, and police incident reports as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I found and sort of what actually does work to prevent these things. So just to give you two brief quotes here to give you a sense as to what our general sort of reaction has been sort of to exaggerate the risk perception, to assume that school shootings are happening a lot more frequently than they actually do, and to they're happening everywhere when they are not. There is a pattern to where they tend to occur. Right, so an increased desire for risk control, regardless of what sort of the costs are of that. So one Principal McGann here, right, this kind of thing can happen anywhere, and so there's no room for complacency. Right, Principal Walsh says, Columbine made people vigilant, and in some cases, hyper-vigilant. 99% of the time, it's nothing, but you only have to be wrong once, so it's better to overreact than underreact, which I think is a telling sort of point there, right? That it's better to overreact than underreact. I have an article called that, better to overreact than underreact, because I think that's sort of fundamentally a problematic sort of reaction if you don't necessarily think about what the costs and consequences of those reactions are. And so often our reaction has been along these lines in terms of what we're going to do to solve this issue of school shootings. What are we going to do about it? So I'll talk a little bit about contemporary practice, what we tend to do, what our reaction tends to be. And the American response has largely been to increase sort of punitive discipline, amplify security. And a lot of things that are not necessarily rooted in empirically proven methods, so not necessarily the best use of our time or resources. And I'll talk about ways in which actually a lot of what we're doing may in fact be counterproductive and actually increase not only the school-to-prison pipeline, but also the likelihood of more school shootings happening. So first we'll talk about zero-tolerance policies. I mentioned this a little bit, right? This was the issue that happened with my friend Matt here. And often it entails mandatory suspensions, expulsions, arrests. Everyone gets the same punishment regardless of circumstances, which in part was imposed initially to try to deal with sort of racial disproportionality in student punishment. However, what we found is that zero-tolerance policies are absolutely much more harshly utilized against students of color. There's no question that's true, just about everywhere. So that sort of maybe initially was thought to be a good idea, but in practice has not really been successful by that metric. And initially, the first example of a zero-tolerance policy policy was the Gun-Free Schools Act in 1994 by the Clinton administration, which basically said that is a mandatory expulsion for bringing a gun to school, which I think is fairly reasonable. But what we've seen since then is lots of local school districts imposing their own forms of zero tolerance policies. And so, mandatory either suspensions or sometimes expulsions, other kind of punishments for example, bringing over-the-counter medications to school and giving them to their peers, like things like Tylenol or aspirin, accidentally bringing utensils with their lunch, bringing toy weapons to school grounds, for physically defending yourself, for making questionable gestures or threatening comments. So some sort of classic examples of this, of maybe some of the, when this has been used the worst, is an example of a 8-year-old boy pointing a chicken nugget at his teacher and saying pow pow, and that resulted in a suspension. A Boy Scout was doing a wood chopping demonstration the night before he goes to school. He puts the axe that he was using for that in the bed of his truck, forgets about it. That's an automatic suspension. And recently, another example in Texas where a girl who's an honor student points like a finger gun, goes like this to her teacher who's teaching at the classroom, and points her finger at the teacher, and that student is then expelled and actually charged with making terrorist threats. So this kind of stuff, and there's lots of examples I could talk about, but of this kind of stuff. So I'll just mention briefly, there's really no evidence at all of any kind that this results in crime reduction. We've certainly seen more school shootings actually occur since we've started imposing these in the late 90s. And also, sort of just if you think about why this doesn't work, right? It doesn't de-escalate conflicts. It doesn't resolve the problems of the students. And it just sort of makes them angrier in many cases, right? So there's been a number of cases where school shooters viewed this sort of last, being expelled or being suspended, this experience with this punitive discipline as being a last straw, this is an acute strain before their attack. That was true in Florida in the recent attack there, right? He was expelled shortly before he decided to go back to his school and kill all those people. And I'll talk a little bit more about why this also discourages people from coming forward and reporting threats, and why that's problematic too. Also, the second one we can talk about here is increased surveillance via security cameras and school resource officers, of which we've seen massive increase in across the board in lots of different schools. Tends to be particularly the security camera is a solution that wealthy schools, affluent schools tend to like. Affluent schools tends to be the only schools that have actually high quality security cameras. But the problem is, you have to actually, for this to work as a way of deterring or preventing school shootings with a security camera, you actually have to have someone watching the security camera. And almost no schools do that. Most schools typically have it in the it's on the feed in like the office, the front office or something like that, and no one's watching it. And often for good reason. They do go look at that feed, they look at that footage if there's vandalism or something like that. But for someone to actually be actively looking at it and ready and waiting for someone to come up to the school with a gun, that has never happened historically and is unlikely to actually happen anyway. But we do, it's one of the big sort of solutions we've had. Plus also, often school shooters are perfectly happy to have the video footage freely available. You can watch video footage of Columbine. They had a video camera there, and you can watch the footage to this day, right? So they want that fame. They want that video footage to be available too. So really not a deterrent. Likewise, when we talk about school resource officers, which has been sort of a bipartisan solution to have more school resource officers in schools. So school resource officers they're police officers, they're regular police officers, but their beat is the school. So they go to school every day to work there. And they definitely have been helpful in a number of ways. They have been helpful to speed up response time, certainly. In some situations, SROs did prevent attacks either by being the first on the scene or by calling for backup, confronting the shooter sometimes. And even what actually is most common is them being alerted about the threat by other students, which I'll talk more about is often how these things are prevented. So many students have gone to police officers to report that, which is I think more common and a sort of important thing to look at, as opposed to what often the conversation that you get is the idea that if you have school resource officers on your on your campus, if you hire them for your school, you will not have a school shooting. It's a deterrent. Someone wouldn't shoot up the school there. And that's just objectively wrong, objectively not true. Just about every school shooting has had police officers there. Certainly if you talk about every university shooting has had school police. So that is not necessarily true that just because you have police at a school or at a university, you're not going to necessarily have a school shooting. And often in a lot of the cases that I looked at, their plan, whether or not they'd actually be able to accomplish this, was to actually just incapacitate or kill the school resource officer first and then commit the rest of the shooting. So it's not necessarily going to deter them in the way it might for other types of crimes or other types of things. Okay, arming teachers and faculty. This is a obviously controversial topic that has gotten more attention recently, which really is unfortunate. There's no empirical evidence to suggest this is a good idea, and a heck of a lot that shows it's a terrible idea. That really is far more likely to have accidents and police, for example, not to know who the active shooter is if you have lots of people armed in the situation, and there have been lots of situations where that has happened, where the police arrive and they don't necessarily, if there's multiple people with weapons on the scene, they don't know who the shooter is and have accidentally almost killed the hero in various situations. So generally, it's not a good idea to have lots of people who are not armed, who are not sort of sufficiently knowledgeable about firearms, who don't necessarily have the same kind of firearm training that police would have. In this kind of high-pressure situation, the potential for all sorts of terrible things to happen is quite high. So not a great solution by any means. Last one, we'll talk about crime prevention through environmental design, right, which is the idea of trying to prevent crime through various forms, various ways of changing the school environment itself. This is something that's very popular. Lots of schools have devoted a lot of time to. That's something I know UW-T does extensively around our campus. And there are various forms of this. Sometimes that includes things like changing the lighting, having a more well-lit areas, either inside or outside the school. Architecture, so you have long hallways, so you don't have areas to hide behind, things like this. And so that also sometimes includes things like locked doors, also metal detectors in some situations as well. I'll mention some of these things. Certainly, it's helpful, some of these things to have, not have areas where that have obscured views with large bushes where someone could be attacked and assaulted. That has a practical help to it. But if we're talking about things like metal detectors, it's really not a helpful sort of solution at all. In part because it's extremely expensive. Running a metal detector is extremely expensive. It takes a really long time for students to go through them. If you're, New York City public schools, a lot of them have metal detectors. It takes you have to get there almost an hour early just to go through the metal detectors, let alone sort of the other sort of concerns, which is that this might amplify this idea that school is like prison, doesn't necessarily help the school environment, which I'll talk about why that matters as well in a moment, about that being particularly problematic for kids reporting stuff when they have that kind of an environment. But also, there's cases, for example, of Red Lake shooting in Minnesota, right? They had metal detectors at that school. He just shot the person running the metal detector, right? If your plan is to kill yourself at the end of this, if you're not concerned with making it out, or if you're not going to kill yourself, maybe you'll just go to prison. But you're not concerned with getting away with this. You're going to just shoot the person running the metal detector, right? That's not going to stop you. So not necessarily a helpful solution, specifically with regard to school shootings at all. So I'll just mention real briefly some of the other stuff that people are doing, which is just to mention quickly here for the sake of time, which is to say that there's various forms of violence risk assessment, trying to assess whether or not someone has violence potential, of which there are a number of ways which are fairly problematic. Various forms of profiling and warning signs, where you're often are trying to estimate someone's violence potential based on various behavioral characteristics, often things which are very broad, like doesn't like school or dress sloppy, and problematic things like that. In contrast to the threat assessment approach, which has a lot more empirical sort of backing behind it. And here what you're doing is you're actually looking at the threat itself, so the substance of the threat. So the idea that not all threats are equivalent, right? How direct is the threat? How detailed? How developed, right? Did you plan it in detail? Did you get supplies? How actionable it is, right? If you just threaten to blow up the moon. That's not a very actionable threat, not a realistic threat, right, as it is something that you could actually carry out, right? So all these kind of things are helpful to assess seriousness, which is a much more helpful approach than a lot of the sort of warning signs or profiling criteria, which there is no one unifying profile. There really isn't. Lots of studies have shown there isn't just sort of one person, one type of person from one type of family even, or one type of background that is true for all school shooters. They do range a great deal. So I'll talk a little bit more about this, but generally, right, the threat assessment approach, a lot more empirical backing, and also when I talked to school administrators, it basically was the criteria that made them the most confident in assessing whether or not a threat was real, was a legitimate threat, and that someone actually was going to actually carry out the attack, was this sort of threat assessment criteria, as opposed to saying, oh, they happen to be a white male loner who listens to goth music or something that is much more nebulous and problematic in a lot of ways. So I'll skip ahead there. Okay. To talk about what really does work. And so increasingly, lots of research has found what is actually preventing these incidents, and it really has to do with bystander intervention. And that's really, I think, where we have to look as what actually works to prevent these things. And that's what I found as well. Former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole, this is her term, the notion of leakage, which basically refers to when students reveal clues that they have an impending attack planned in some ways. These include threats sometimes, warnings to other people, say, don't come to school on Tuesday, something bad's going to happen, boasts about what you're going to do, ultimatums, things like this, or even trying to convince people to go along and join this plot. Right, so people, a number of different ways that leakage can present itself, but what we found is that they're true in the vast majority of cases. There's a famous study by the Safe School Initiative found about people, at least one person knew about people's plans in 81% of school attacks. However, studies sort of also say that students are likely to say that they're not going to necessarily tell people. If they do have knowledge about these threats, they're not necessarily going to come forward. And so we have this student code of silence or culture of silence, where students might hear about these kind of things but don't come forward. And so why is that a problem? And how do you address that? And what we've seen, and these are a lot of pretty respectable, well-known researchers in terms of school shooting and criminology more broadly, who have argued that based on Columbine and all these recent school shooting attacks, we don't have to worry about this anymore, right? School shootings are no longer, have made people realize how serious this is, so kids are going to come forward. And that's also true, right? Just some quotes from people that I interviewed here, right? A couple principal and head of school security, basically echoing the same idea that don't worry, it made kids less afraid to speak up, right? If something wasn't right, so then people are more likely to come forward now. And so that's generally right. That was the consensus among academics and even the administrators and the security officers that I spoke to. That is not what I found, though. If you actually break that down and look at it, it's really not the case that kids are coming forward a lot more, or even a lot in general. And so, if you look at this stuff, what I found basically interventions. This took about 4 different types, right? There were indirectly informed bystanders. So someone happens to see a graffiti on a wall saying you're going to shoot up the school. That they're a bystander. They're not like told directly, but they hear about it somehow, or they come across a website or a list or something like that, right? Directly informed confidants, so someone who you think is what we maybe think of as the person who's going to intervene in these situations, where you have like a close friend or confidant who hears about their friend shooting up the school and then comes forward. That does happen. That did happen. But I'll tell you that's not the only sort of way that these things were averted. Threatened targets, so people who were actually threatened themselves came forward, as well as involved co-conspirators. So there were cases where someone who basically at one time was part of this plan as well. That's true in one particular case where there are 4 boys all planning to shoot up the school together. One of them has a sort of incident where he is institutionalized because his parents are scared he's going to kill himself. He gets institutionalized and gets better. And when he's in the institution, he determines he doesn't want to do this anymore. And when he tells his friends, his co-conspirators, they all get scared that he's going to tell everyone. So they decide to go to the security officer and to one of the guidance counselors and basically blame it all on him. And so they go and blame the whole sort of plan on him. It doesn't come out what really happened until it goes to the grand jury. So the idea is that right, it could also be other reasons that people might come forward, their own self-interest. It isn't necessarily because you're scared about what's going to happen to everybody else. And so what I found basically is that there are all these different types. It's not just sort of this idea of directly informed confidants or even the bystanders who were coming forward. You also had these other situations. And people coming forward were rarely directly informed confidants or close friends. They were often acquaintances, targets, or even co-conspirators. So often, the people who knew about this impending plan to attack the school and were good friends with the person planning it didn't come forward when other people did. And in nearly all cases, far more students knew and did not come forward than the number of students who knew about the attack and did come forward. So in one case that I looked at, only one student came forward, one girl came forward, and there were another documented sort of 15 students who knew about it, knew about the plan in pretty good detail, but decided not to come forward. And those are just 15 students who we know about because they were willing to sort of give court testimony. So I think that when you have an incident where one person comes forward, 15 people don't, I think that's not evidence of sort of this code of silence getting better and that people coming forward. It's really evidence of this still being a pretty persistent issue with kids not coming forward. So why is that? Why is that such a problem? Why are kids not coming forward? And I think to answer that question, you have to look at sort of the current state of school discipline and the current state of how we have decided to deal with school discipline in our schools, right? And the idea is that we need to have genuinely positive school climates. And there's tons of research in criminal justice, in sociology, in education that shows there's a clear link between positive school environments and positive bystander behavior. That is, when you have a school environment where people trust the school, where they feel safe, where they feel welcome, where they don't feel like they are going to get in trouble for coming forward, or if they feel like the school discipline is equitable and fair, or that they have some sort of say in what happens, and it's not just particularly punitive against certain students or biased against students of color, or that it's unnecessarily punitive and you can't trust the people in the building. If you have a positive school environment where people feel safe, feel that school rules are fair, all these kinds of things, that is the kind of school where that's kind of school climate where people are much more likely to come forward to report all kinds of things. So that's true for extreme cases like school shootings, but also much more minor things like bullying or vandalism, domestic violence, all sorts of other things that they might experience. All those things are shown to be linked. You're much more likely to report all of those things if you have a positive school environment. So skip ahead here. I know we're short on time. So just mention, right, there's lots of research that shows there's a link here. And so the focus has to be on forging positive school climates. And the best way to do that, and there's a lot of research on this as well, how do you create a positive school environment? How do you create a school environment where students feel like there is a sense of procedural justice, where there's fairness in terms of the school policies and how they're enacted? How do you create a school where people feel like they trust and can come to their teacher, their administrator, their principal if they have an issue? Really is from restorative disciplinary practices. So coming from restorative justice, this is sort of restorative justice practices applied to the school setting. And just to some of the various benefits of positive school climates here. Just in sort of general, in case you're not familiar with restorative justice and what it means. Generally, right, this is an approach that tries to be sort of less punitive, but instead trying to repair the harm that happens that's caused by crime, and considering sort of all people who are involved in that situation, whether that's the victims, whether that's the offenders, and the communities at large, and all sort of parties are sort of collaboratively try to determine what the solutions are. right? So it's concerned with healing wounds, restoring offenders to their law-abiding lives, repairing harm, and sort of having victims take an active role where they can understand the harm that they've caused to their victims and to sort of take responsibility for their actions. So these kind of sort of atmospheres, these kind of environments where schools do these kinds of things are the kind of schools where not only do these types of schools see, let's skip ahead here, sort of improve school climate, which is important, so that's true, right? Improving relationships among student and faculty, increased student trust in school authority figures, increased satisfaction with disciplinary outcomes, increased view of procedural justice and fairness of punishment, and that's true from studies in the United States as well as in other parts of the world, particularly in England and Australia and New Zealand, where there's a lot more time and energy and resources spent behind restorative discipline in schools and in the juvenile justice system. But the added benefit, in addition to sort of this directly with a result of probably decreasing school shootings, we have all these other benefits as well. So as opposed to all these sort of punitive things, which also have the added costs of contributing to the school to prison pipeline and all the other things that we're doing to harm the school environment, right? If we do restorative discipline, we also have all of these added bonuses as well, all of these added benefits as well. So we also increased sort of responsibility among students, reporting of problematic behaviors, as I said, to staff, increased victim satisfaction and healing, offender empathy, reduced juvenile delinquency and reoffending, reduced suspensions, improve both staff and student attendance. So even the faculty and staff attendance goes up in these types of schools. Student tardiness decreases, and even parents feel more connected to the school. So, sort of the last thing I'll say here, what's sort of important to remember, right? So, and I talked about this briefly, but right, the value of the threat assessment criteria, that kind of stuff, is what school officials found to be most important and gave them most confidence in what they thought was actually going to happen there. And that sort of speaks to the importance of valuing context and sort of over zero tolerance and unreliable predictive measures, or sort of looking at those kind of things. And also the focus has to be on forging positive school climates and restorative disciplinary practices, right? This increases positive bystander behavior when leakage does occur. And the benefit of sort of both of these approaches, both of these things that if we move in that direction, not only will thwart rampage attacks, not only will make rampage attacks less likely to occur in the first place, and if there is a potential threat, they'll be more likely to come to the attention of authorities and to be averted. But also, right, they will have the additional benefit of reducing school exclusions and diminishing the school to prison pipeline as well. So we're going to have that benefit as well. So I'll leave it at there. Leave it at that. Thanks very much. So we'll open if there are questions. Yeah, please.
Have you found any good statistics on race related to this? It seems like most of the shootings are white males doing it.
For sure.
There's a few other examples I've seen of black males, but overwhelmingly seems to be white males. And
for sure, that's true.
No women, it seems.
Yeah, so very few women, and you're right, it does tend to be absolutely mostly white boys and men for sure. There have been a few cases, right? There have been, there's some Korean Americans, there's been some Native American shooters and some biracial ones, and that has existed. And we do have school shootings in other countries, in Brazil and stuff like that. But also, the other countries where school shootings tend to happen most frequently are Germany and Finland, so also quite white countries as well. So yeah, it is definitely a predominantly a white phenomenon. All the schools I looked at were predominantly white. All those 11 schools that were averted were all predominantly white schools, suburban and rural schools. So that is definitely true. It tends to be.
Do you see any correlation with racism? Because we know the Dylan Roof one in South Carolina was definitely all about race.
Sure.
He was crazy, but yes, it was about
Yeah,
race.
well, so I will tell you, so it's interesting. So they do often, and part of this results from like copycat effect and this influence from Columbine, a lot of them do have this like natural selection sort of idea about things that they will actively talk about. So even like some of those cases where they have been like minority shooters still identify as like white supremacists. And so that's true of the Native American shooter at Red Lake Reservation also actively called himself a Nazi and stuff like that. So there isn't a relationship there, I think, which I think has to do with a number of things, but definitely part of it is this sort of copycat effect that they all are sort of influenced by the ones that happened before them. And so, yeah, that is definitely part of what's going on, for sure. Yeah.
Schools that have, okay. Do you have examples of schools who have tried to create a more restorative atmosphere in the school? Like specifically, what
Yeah.
are some of the things that they actually do?
Yeah, so the best example and the most sort of well-funded, sort of long-term example is the Oakland Unified School District in California. That's the school that has, it's a fundamental part of their approach to sort of education, and so it's well-funded, it's integrated, well-integrated in the school, and they really are deeply committed to that, right? And so they, they have circles every day, but weekly and often, and they sort of, if they have issues with students, they have them confront those and talk about them out, and don't just punish kids, but actually address why they are upset about things in the first place. If they have home issues, if they have a conflict between students, they'll try to mediate that and address what the problem is among themselves. So that's true. I mean, what's interesting is one of the schools that I looked at is actually, it's a school just in rural Pennsylvania that is famous for, is well known for, not as famous as Oakland, but well known for doing restorative discipline too. And that's one of the schools that I looked at that actually had like a person turn in his friend. So that is an example where it really sort of was a school that had this sort of culture and atmosphere, and where it really was sort of a successful example of someone coming forward. So I do think it is beneficial in a lot of ways, but with regard to this problem specifically, it also is. Yeah.
And do they bring in outside people to change this atmosphere, or do they actually train the staff and the teachers and so forth to do this?
It's usually both. So often they will bring in particular people who are trained in this, or they get to be that their sort of specialty. I was in Wichita for a talk like last year, and I had a lot of people come who were involved in that, and so it was people from it wasn't even necessarily people who were sort of strictly trained as restorative justice professionals, but who would do that work and sort of came from the community and sort of just were people who were well integrated in the community and knew lots of people and were there for a long time and who were deeply devoted to it. But I think there's lots of ways it can be done, but I think there are people now who are sort of well developed in this field and can really consult with schools or to really implement this in a effective way. Even though it's still a very new area, it really is something that is not sort of widely known about or widely implemented. Not only sort of restorative justice in general, but also restorative discipline in schools specifically.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is that you come this particular issue from the perspective of criminal justice, but it's something about education, and I want to wonder whether that the education departments of School of Educations are there scholars who just also study the similar phenomenon,
Yeah.
and whether you are just using a similar language or whether there are some collaborations, and how does that the interdisciplinary collaboration on this the issue may look like?
Yeah. So
and Matt here, maybe Matt may want to join.
yeah. So there are some. I think the most notable examples, right? So one is Dewey Cornell, who's pretty famous for this stuff, who was at University of Virginia, but he's in School of school psychology, I think, is one sort of example of this who does that kind of work, and Jeff Daniels, not the actor. Jeff Daniels is another. It's a education scholar who does stuff on this as well. And look, he's actually the only person who's also looked at sort of averted incidents. And so he also sort of has a school counseling kind of. That's where he comes from. Specifically in terms of education, I think, and my work is sort of interdisciplinary. I'm a sociologist, but I teach in criminal justice, and so I looked at all sorts of wealth of different research across this, and I think it's still in its infancy in kind of all those disciplines, but there are, you can find it where you can find it.
I would just add that a lot of the work on restorative justice isn't necessarily linking to the school shootings.
Yeah.
It's linking to school prison pipelines,
Yeah.
issues, and that. So I think it's a multicultural and equity education that's really has its loudest components.
No, so that's a fair point. It's true. I am probably the only proponent of restorative justice as it relates to school shootings. That is probably me. I am like the one person who says that, so that I'm unique in that. But there are a lot of people who talk about sort of the relationship between restorative discipline and crime more generally and other sorts of crime. But yeah, I am unique in sort of linking how these things are connected. Yeah.
So one of the things that I've always been kind of particularly interested in has been the media reaction to school shootings and mass shootings. And so I know that you've done some work in this about sort of limiting the attention that the shooters actually seek. And
Yeah.
I'm curious as to how receptive folks have been with that message. I actually, this came across in... Shortly after the Vegas shooting, I was watching a 24-hour cable news station, and during the one show, the reporter had discussed the fact that they were going to limit the showing of the picture and discussing the person by name. And then the show ended, and then the next show began, and within seconds of that show beginning, they put the picture of the shooter and mentioned his name. So I was curious that even within, it seems, the community, that they might be...
Yeah, it's mixed. Sometimes you've gotten sort of real support, and because I do talk to journalists a lot. I have a lot of sort of experience, being interviewed by them, and sometimes they, have a reasonable sort of sense about that and try to recognize the potential harms associated with it and have a more, I think, responsible sort of attitude. But sometimes they don't, and sometimes even if I talk to them about them, they'll still publish the names anyway, and publish the pictures as well. And so sometimes you can have a more nuanced conversation where you say, okay, maybe if you need to feel like it's noteworthy or newsworthy at the sort of outset, and you want to have I don't think there's any reason really to have the picture ever, but if you want to have the name, but maybe over, you don't need to continue publicizing the name a year after the fact and things like that. And sometimes people are more amenable to that, but I think it depends. And I think, it is sort of a thing where you do have, increasing support of prominent media figures and bipartisan support actually among a number of, politicians on the left and right too. So I think it is a conversation that people are having and that are increasingly thinking about. But it's a mixed response, I guess.
Can you speak to how social media has changed how these things are planned?
Yeah. So
Can you speak to how social media has changed how these things are planned and thwarted sometimes?
Yeah, so there was numerous cases where people had deliberately planned this or had a devoted sort of private page, sometimes a public page, to planning this stuff. And so that is how sometimes they were thwarted by someone like coming across that page, and where they have like a ticking time bomb, or ticking with a date about when they're going to do it, and sometimes there are messages between them about how they're going to plan things. So that definitely did occur in some cases. The ability for either law enforcement or the school administration to monitor that stuff, or even be aware of how to interpret it is not great necessarily, but and even ethically problematic depending on what you're talking about. But I think it is something that did result in people planning it in that sort of virtual space, which other people got access to. So it was better them doing that there than in a notebook that no one would find. So that did help some of those things come out, certainly. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So I have just a question. The issue of leakage and the response, it seems like what you're suggesting here is that there should be some sort of a preventative environment in the schools. But when we're talking about leakage and extreme violence, the response, isn't it more typically law enforcement, that sort of thing? So, at what point would that be a positive?
Well, so there actually were no cases that I found where someone directly went to law enforcement about this. They often went, so they did go to law enforcement if there was a school resource officer. There were a few cases where people went to the police officer, their local police officer, and a couple cases where they went to, they talked to their parents, or they talked to another teacher who then involved the police. And often it was a teacher or an administrator. That's who they most typically went to. But there were actually no cases where someone, at least in that 11, there may be some in the larger sample, where someone directly just called the police. That actually didn't happen. Which is interesting, and I think does speak to the idea that you really want to have someone that you trust, because there are other solutions. People have said, you have anonymous, phone lines to report these kind of things, and some schools, particularly in Colorado, has done that, to have anonymous reporting systems. I think that's fine, but I think there's not a lot of evidence that people are going to necessarily feel confident that something's going to be taken seriously or that they trust that situation that it'll be handled appropriately. So I think that's not necessarily the only solution you can have. And the other thing is the other concern, right, is if people are going to report this stuff, fake accusations, which does happen, and there have been cases where that has occurred. They're pretty rare, but they have happened, and that's certainly something you want to be able to vet. Which again, I think looking at threat assessment and looking at how serious and substantial a threat really is what you can do to address that, as opposed to just assuming that just because that every threat is equally serious or that every threat is legitimate necessarily.
Yeah, I guess and just kind of related to that.
Yeah.
In the Douglas is it Douglas Furman or Furman Douglas? I always get that wrong.
Oh.
The Florida shooting in
February. Yeah.
But there was leakage, right? Do you know
Yes.
the scope and how?
Yes.
Where did the leak go? And
yeah, so we don't know that. It's true. That is the one case, and that's in fact people say that before too. Like that's the one case where there absolutely was leakage and nothing was done about it. Number one, that's abhorrent and terrible and rare. That's the only case I've heard of that happening. And I don't know what happened down the line. I don't know where. I assume the FBI dropped the ball there. I don't exactly know what happened. I've tried to look that up, but I don't know. Why people didn't follow up or really involved there. And it's true that lots of people had tried to intervene. There was lots of leakage on him because he had a long history of doing all sorts of problematic stuff and threatening people and saying things along these lines. So a lot of people actually did come forward in that case, but ultimately I don't know why nothing was done. It's a good question.
So I just have a wondering about when you talked about schools, you kind of profiled the kind of schools, very homogeneous, and that probably goes towards the environment the school is in, and how does that relate to trying to implement restorative disciplinary practices? Because homogeneous schools may not think in that direction, because as that gentleman pointed out, it's usually more around equity and things like that.
No, that's true, right? So even the schools that tend to do restorative discipline, restorative justice, do tend to be schools that are pretty diverse schools that are concerned with issues about the school-to-prison pipeline. So Oakland, even the school in Wichita, is like the most ethically diverse high school in Wichita. So that's for for a reason there. So although there are examples where the rural school in Pennsylvania is a white rural school that has done this, and so there are schools that do this. Certainly there's schools also in other countries that do restorative discipline, restorative justice practices that are less diverse. But it's true that those are where they tend to be implemented. And again, I think that's because the people tend to think about this as a solution to sort of crime problems more broadly. So they tend to think about it in those kind of communities where they have issues of high crime rates, as opposed to where mass school shootings tend to occur are rural and suburban areas, which tend to have low crime rates typically, right? So they're sort of an aberrant event in that way. So yeah, but I think there's arguments to be made that for those students who are marginalized or for sort of even just the health of the school in general, I think it's an approach that is helpful everywhere, not just in more diverse urban schools. Yeah.
It seems like I used to hear these things talked about as if in terms of like a moral panic kind of framework. Could you speak to when you think it's useful to think of it that way, and maybe when it's not useful to frame it or think of it that way?
Yeah.
I just taught that this morning, so that's probably why.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I wrote an article actually, the article I said about better to overreact is about using a moral panic frame, right? How you understand this is because when I talk to a lot of principals, a lot of teachers, a lot of people, parents, talk about this stuff as oh, this is happening everywhere, increasingly it's happening all the time, and that's just not true. It's not sort of this universally sort of threat that's happening. This is equally likely to happen everywhere, equally likely to happen by all students and stuff like that. It's not really true, right? So and people tend to exaggerate the threat. People think that it's much more likely to happen, like you saw, they don't think of it as oh, I might get hit by lightning, that kind of a ratio. People don't think about it that way, right? So I think that's true, and people over exaggerate it. I think there's more at it than that. So and part of this is, I actually never wrote about this. I wrote about this in my dissertation, but nowhere else. But about how moral panic is not the only way, because it's also about neoliberal penality and neoliberal sort of approaches to punishment. So one fuels the other, right? So we have, and this is where like Naomi Klein's like shock doctrine is the idea that you have a devastating sort of climate event, and in the wake of that, in Chile or other places, you then have an excuse to do really reactionary sort of extremist policies that take away any kind of social services and stuff like that. And I would say it's the same kind of thing. So it's both working in tandem. So it's moral panic, where you have people think that there's this it is a devastating event, but think that it's happening more frequently all the time, and then that is used as an excuse to then have more metal detectors, have more, take away the basic school, liberties that students should enjoy as an excuse to do that kind of stuff, which further reinforces, all the profit-making other kind of things that you can make out of that from school security systems in the first place. So I think it's both of those things is what I'd say. Yeah. Well, thanks very much, guys. Appreciate you all coming out.